The next three slides are getting at the interaction between sex, gender, and sexual orientation and gender identity and all those sorts of things. So I'm going to start with the genderbread person to help us to understand the differences between these issues that often get lumped together as one big issue. Let's start with gender. No, actually, let me start with biological sex, which is the third one down. You've heard us say, well, there's only two sexes. There's XX and XY, which is not true. In fact, there are people who are intersexed who are maybe genetically male, but present phenotypically as female. Those people are called intersexed, or they have an androgen insensitivity, sensitivity to it. So basically their body doesn't recognize testosterone and other androgen type hormones. And so they present as female, right? Because that would be the default otherwise. So if your body doesn't absorb, understand, recognize testosterone and other male hormones, you will present as female. And so there are a number of individuals out there. If you've ever heard of the person Eden Atwood, she was a singer who, if you were to look at her, she was a woman, and sings, has a voice like a woman, but is absolutely genetically male inside. We also have people that are XXY or XYY, Fragile X, X0. There's all sorts of variations between XX and XY. Are they the majority? No, but they have a high level of prevalence out there. So biology is not just XX and XY. That we learned that in 5th or 6th grade. As we got to college and we learned college biology and we learned more in-depth stuff, we recognized, right, that there's a whole continuum of genetic expressions when it comes to the sex gene in there. So obviously there's all sorts of variations in that, including the intersex thing. Gender identity is how my brain sees me versus what my body expresses. So what people see when a child is born, they look at the genitals and they make the assumption that this person is going to be female or male. So that's why we call it assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth, because we look at the genitals and we make that assumption. But we don't know, who that person truly is until we learn what their brain tells them they are. And you might be scoffing at this moment, but let me explain a little bit more about it. Here's what we know about the way the brain works. And this is why it's incredibly fascinating to me to understand this more and more. We know that the brain of trans women or people who are assigned male at birth who identify as a woman, their brain patterns are similar to what we call cisgender women who were born female at birth or assigned female at birth and identify as female. That the trans women have brain waves that match those of cisgender women. And the same in reverse for trans men who were assigned female at birth. Trans men have brainwave patterns that are very similar to men who are cisgender, who were born male and identify as male. So there is a mismatch now between what the brain says and what the body says. And we know this happens in utero. We're not particularly clear on the mechanisms for it. Some people argue that there's a feminization of the brain or something that it impacts the way that the brain sees things. But nonetheless, we do know that something happens in utero that creates that mismatch between what the brain sees and what the body presents as for whatever reasons. And so asking someone to live in a body that they're uncomfortable with is a big part of the problem. It's like if you were left-handed and told you needed to use your right hand all the time, or vice versa, you were right-handed and told to use your left hand. It doesn't feel comfortable. You're not going to do your best. You're not going to be successful. And we know, right? Left-handed people who are using tools meant for people who are right-handed get hurt all the time. So that's a simplistic perspective, but imagine it up to the level of, gender identity and gender expression and what that means, how problematic that is. So recognizing gender identity can be identify as a woman, even if that doesn't match with my biological sex. When there's a mismatch, that's what we call transgender. And people try to figure out how to best align the gender that their brain says they are versus the gender that their body says they are, the rest of their body says they are. And when there's that mismatch, they have to figure out how to make it match. And sometimes people do hormone therapy, sometimes people do surgery, sometimes people just say, you know what, I'm a guy, deal with it. No sweat off my back, right? Same thing on the other end for men, making sure that that alignment is there. The middle part we see here, it's called genderqueer. And genderqueer can be an expression in a whole lot of different ways. It can be, I don't feel either male or female, I just feel like I'm me. And that's often what people call genderqueer. It's more of an umbrella term, but generally it's like, I don't feel male or female, I just am. Non-binary means similarly, right? I don't feel male, I don't feel female, I feel both, right? Or they can be gender fluid, where today I'm feeling more feminine, tomorrow I feel more masculine, and they sort of, vacillate a little bit between the two. It's usually people in that middle category that prefer the they, them pronouns or some variation on pronoun usage, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But just so you're clear what genderqueer means. It basically means they're not fit in one category or the other. They're kind of in this amorphous middle where they feel like both or neither, at times. Gender expression is really about how you choose to dress and behave. It has nothing to do with anything genetic. Katie Lang will tell you she is all female and she's a lesbian, but she dresses in an androgynous way. If you were a big fan of the Eurythmics back in the day, the lead singer Annie Lennox presented it very androgynously. David Bowie presented very androgynously. The point is that they were experimenting with different levels of expression of their feminine and masculine sides. If you're feminine, you tend to be more interested in dresses and makeup and things like that. If you're more masculine, it's a very different, presentation. I know, and androgynous is kind of like, I don't fit either. I'm just sort of being me right there, straight line in the middle. So it's acting, how we act, how we behave, how we present ourselves. And we can be straight and be androgynous. We can be queer and be androgynous. We can be transgender and be androgynous. We can be, any mixture of those things. There's no pattern that says because you're a lesbian, you must be masculine in your approach to things. Obviously, even in the lesbian community, there's a wide variety of gender expressions out there, as well as gender identities. Lastly is sexual orientation, and this has to do with to whom we are attracted sexually and romantically, if you will. And obviously we can break down orientation into romantic association versus sexual association, but we'll just keep it simple and talk about sexual orientation here. Heterosexual means I sleep with somebody and I'm attracted to somebody of the opposite sex from me. Homosexual, obviously, it's somebody who's attracted to the same sex as themselves. And bisexual means they're attracted to both. You may also hear it called pansexual or and they're basically the same, but bisexual assumes it's a binary in the words. Although I know many bisexual people who don't think about it as a binary. They think about they just love whoever they love, and that's perfectly fine. But you may hear somebody be called pansexual, and that typically means that they are comfortable with any sexual presentation as well as any gender identity presentation. So they are okay with a trans woman or a trans man or somebody who's gender non-binary or gender queer. It doesn't matter to them. They just love the person who they love and they're attracted to whoever they're attracted to. So the genderbread tries to differentiate between who we love, how we present ourselves, what our sexual organs and our genetic basis is, and then how our brain thinks about who we are when we look at ourselves in the mirror. People try to conflate all of these issues, but they're very unique and there's a lot of interaction between them. but they are not tremendous overlap. There's not like everything is the same. So every male must present this way and every female must present this way. It's a wide variety. And I think this is where people get really struggle, when they're looking at these things, is not really understanding some of those differences and those nuances, out there about those different terminology and what the terminology means. So hopefully this is helpful to help you understand what all this terminology means. So now let's talk a little bit more specifically about sex under gender. And we've already covered some of the basics of this, but these are some of the bigger issues to be aware of. Number one, sexual harassment is usually based on harassing somebody because of their sex or their gender expression, because gender expression, as you know, is covered into that. And so it could be quid pro quo harassment, or it could be hostile working environment harassment. Either way, we don't discriminate based on sex or gender, and we don't treat people differently because of their sex in that situation. And then, of course, we move on to this notion of the gender norms and the stereotypes, right? It's against the law to set certain expectations for how women are supposed to behave and how men are supposed to behave. So requiring women to behave in a certain way, different from the way we require men, treating women differently because they have children. Men get a boost when they have children. Women get a demerit when they have children. So men are considered more stable and more employable when they are married and have children, and women are considered less employable when they are married and have children, for a whole variety of reasons. And so, the norms or the expectations, the stereotype that a woman is only supposed to be feminine with fingernail polish and makeup and their hair done and dresses. And if they don't dress that way, that's considered a problem. And it's a double bind for women, right? They are discriminated against for not being men, but when they act like men, then they get told they're not being feminine enough. So it's a double bind. And men have similar problems, but for different reasons, right? When men are told to be in touch with their feminine side, they do that, then they get harassed because they're being too feminine in their way. And there's a lot of society pressure on men to behave in a particular way, as more masculine in their approach. And this is where the discussion about toxic masculinity and things like that comes into play. Masculinity, by definition, is not toxic. It's a certain form of masculine behavior that adheres to strict gender norms and gender stereotypes about the way that we are supposed to behave. And it puts other people down or marginalizes other people because of it. And that's problematic. And that's really the big argument that people are fighting right now about toxic masculinity, if you will. Pregnancy discrimination, as I said, women get treated differently because they're pregnant, and they get discriminated because of that. Because of that, men actually get a boost, as I said. Glass ceiling issues aren't just for racial and ethnic groups. It's also for women. Women experience the same sort of problems breaking through that glass ceiling. And we've already addressed the issues of transgender, transsexual, and intersex terminology. We don't really use the term transsexual anymore. It's usually either transgender. Cross-dressing is considered a different category. You can be a straight male and still like to wear women's clothes. That's a gender expression issue. And being intersexed, we know that's a biology-based issue, right? Where my genetic makeup and my sex-based organs just don't seem to align for whatever reason. But the issues that come along with this is making sure that we provide bathroom opportunities for people particularly people who are transgender, having opportunities to bathrooms. How do we address name change issues? There's a whole host of things that we really need to pay attention to when we are trying to support transgender people in our workplace. But respect for pronouns, respect for their bathroom choices, respect for name changes and dead naming. Dead naming, basically, we call somebody by their former name, even though they've changed their name based on their transgender identity. So if they've always been called Jim and they now want to be called Janet, calling somebody Jim, even when they're presenting as female, is considered dead naming, and that's inappropriate and disrespectful to people. Some companies offer, benefits for transition, where they offer surgery and hormone replacement in their healthcare benefits. Most companies do. I think a lot of companies do, but it's, not. There are still many that don't. And we obviously know there's a huge backlash in society now for people who are transgender. It's actually really unsafe for people who are transgender right now in society, particularly in Missouri. Among many states, but Missouri is probably one of the most unsafe places to be transgender right now. So it's certainly a concern if you are transgender and you live and work in Missouri. And I do some consulting work on this in particular, so we always try to do our best to make that work. Anyway, we understand sort of the foundational reasons of what these terms mean, but there are definitely implications for how we handle these things in the workplace. Sexual orientation also has a whole lot of issues that have implications for the workplace. Obviously, right now, same-sex unions are the law of the land, and every state has to provide marriage to anybody who is in a same-sex relationship if they choose to. Civil unions were a compromise from years ago. But we realized that there was a separate but equal kind of thing, that even civil unions did not provide all of the benefits that marriage benefits got for people. Now, there's some debate on this, right, where it's like, marriage is between a man and a woman because the Bible says so. Well, the Bible says many things, but that's not the basis for our law, first and foremost. And if your religion says that that's not okay, then your religion is not obligated to marry people in a same-sex relationship. But religious beliefs don't interfere with civil marriage. Civil marriage is actually legal, and not all marriage has to be religion. So there's a lot of confusion there with the terminology, but call it what you will. Religious marriage is very different than civil marriage. And so no one's interfering with religious marriage and how a religion chooses to define marriage rights, but civil marriage is a different issue entirely in terms of the law. And it's the state that licenses people, right? People can get married, but they don't get the marital rights, the tax benefits, and all those sorts of things unless they are legally married in the eyes of the state. So it's two-pronged, obviously, for people who are religious, that they have a religious connection to the spiritual side of what marriage means for them. But also there is a legal, state-based perspective on what marriage means too, and the two combined. There used to be the Defense of Marriage Act, which basically, said that same-sex marriage was considered illegal. That has since been repealed for a whole host of reasons over the last number of years. The last Obergefell was the big case that basically said, right, that marriage, should be for everybody. Two consenting adults can get married. It doesn't matter what their sex is. So there is some concern, though, with Roe v. Wade having been struck down, that the law upon which a lot of this stuff has been based, which was this interpretation, was about the right to privacy, and Roe v. Wade was based on that right to privacy. And since that was undermined, then the presumption was, will that undermine other rights? For example, Loving versus Virginia, that made the anti-miscegenation laws illegal. And anti-miscegenation means people of different races marrying. So a white person and a black person getting married was considered illegal in Virginia until sometime in the 60s, I think. So just keeping that in mind. But the biggest issue is, how do we protect same-sex marriage if it gets pushed back to the states, and the states get to decide from state to state who can get married and who can't. And President Biden has passed a law that basically says, it's the Respect for Marriage Act, that says if someone gets married in a different state, even if your state doesn't grant that marriage, you have to honor it. And this was supported by a lot of churches because religion was protected. The LDS Church, the Church of Latter-day Saints, which does not support same-sex marriage, supported this law because the law basically said, look, I don't have to, as long as you're not forcing me to marry somebody in my church, I'll support whatever you want. We don't care. It doesn't affect us. We're not going to stand in the way of this. And so what it basically means is people who are in a same-sex relationship, even if they get married, let's say in Illinois, but they live in Missouri, and Missouri has outlawed it for whatever reason, if there's a repeal of this law, then their marriage still needs to be recognized in the state of Missouri. Even if Missouri doesn't allow for same-sex marriage, it has to respect marriage licenses from other states, no matter what. What that will look like, goodness knows, and hopefully we'll never have to find out. But it's a problem, right? Because if someone is married in one location and not married in another location, let's say I'm married to my spouse. I live in New Jersey and there's marriage rights there. And then my spouse and I move to another state, say Wyoming, where they don't allow for same-sex marriages. I had benefits as a married couple over here in New Jersey, but I no longer have those married benefits in Wyoming, assuming that you've got a branch, right? I've got multiple branches of a company, and one in Wyoming, one in New Jersey, right? I no longer have benefits, and I'm allowed to have benefits in Wyoming when I had them there. That unevenness, that uncertainty for people created a lot of problems in terms of consistency in the application of laws and the consistency of the way HR is handled regarding someone's benefits and their rights and what is considered family and what is considered not family. It's incredibly complex, and this nitpicking at the state level makes things more difficult for people across the board in order to be able to just live their lives in peace. So the benefits is a big problem. And so what marriage rights has done is it said, it doesn't matter where you are, you get access to those marriage rights and those benefits, and doesn't matter what state you're in. It's the federal government recognizes that all those marriages are valid. Obviously, sexual orientation, we talk about people living in the closet or not admitting that, they're gay, and being, private about it, or just ignoring it, or, suppressing their interests. I will tell you, I didn't come out until 40. And so it created a lot of stress for me growing up. There would be moments when I would think about it and then I go, no, I can't be, I don't want to be, and therefore I would hide it again. And so it finally took some major issues in my life for me to take a look at it and go, I think it's time to acknowledge who I am and move forward from there. So when you live in a closet, though, there's a barrier between you and everybody because you're always protecting yourself. There's always a cloak around you that you don't want anybody to know who you are authentically. Remember, we talked about relational and emotional, authenticity and connecting with other people and making sure that we are as authentic as possible. When we have to hide from people, we are not relationally authentic at all. We're not able to have reasonable and open relationships with other people because we're always hiding something. And here's what happens too, right? For those of you that have taken MBA 522, we talked about the brain science behind people who have their frontal cortex overloaded with things. And when our frontal cortex is overloaded with hiding our identity from other people, that leaves very little computing space for the rest of our workload. And so the more that people have to be preoccupied with watching their pronouns and hiding who they're with in a relationship with and what they did and who they hang out with and hiding that information, the more difficult it is for them to give their all to a particular job. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Oh, you're a poor worker because for whatever reason, but in fact, it's not that they're a poor worker. It's that they're so distracted. It's difficult to do their job in a fair and open way, like somebody who would be straight, right? So obviously we don't want to withhold. We want to be authentic. We want people to be able to be who they're meant to be, authentically. We don't want them to hide. We don't want them to have stress. We don't want them to feel like they can't move, right? Like in the days past when someone was, in a state by state, company by company environment where some companies were really inclusive and others weren't, we found people had really big difficulties in being able to move. And in fact, a friend of mine has written a research paper on this, that there were people that could not move to a new location because they were afraid of losing all the benefits that they had living in this one company in this one location. So their mobility got handicapped because they were not able to move from place to place and job to job in a free way as if somebody who was not in the closet could do. So those protections were so important. The last thing, obviously, is this interaction between sexual orientation and religion. And this is a big conflict area, right? Because a religious organization obviously can make whatever rules they want to do. And even privately held businesses are getting more leeway in the workplace to set their own workplace rules on these sorts of things. But the problem is when you are in an organization where you might have somebody who has certain religious beliefs and somebody else who doesn't adhere to those beliefs, that conflict creates some tensions in the workplace. And I've known people who have said, oh, they're gay, I'm not going to talk with them, and I'm not going to interact with them, and I'm not going to work with them because I don't approve of their lifestyle. So I'm not going to do anything with them. I'm not even going to be friends with them or talk with them. I'm not going to interact at all. And I've seen that. And it's harmful because it disrupts the team. It disrupts workflow. It doesn't get the stuff done because everybody's got their own personal beliefs. But at the end of the day, we all have a job to do, right? And we all have to do our jobs. That's what we're getting paid to do. Your religion and your personal beliefs are things that you deal with in your home and in your private life. And I do my thing in my private life. And when we're in the organization, our job is to do our work, period. And how do we manage that? So it's a big issue, and we have to be sensitive to that, where those things conflict with each other. You can't demand that somebody be accepting of somebody who's gay. You can demand that they be civil, absolutely, because that's a civility issue, but you cannot demand that they accept it because they're not going to. So we have to be careful of the language that we use around that as well. And I'm speaking as a lesbian myself. I understand that that's a really difficult place to be in. I've seen it in my own family, right? It's challenging for sure.